Washington's false teeth were made out of wood.
Throughout his life, Washington had several sets of false teeth that were made of materials including human and probably cow and horse teeth, elephant tusks, tin, copper, brass, and silver.
When Washington was 6 years old, he received a hatchet as a gift and damaged his father's cherry tree. When his father discovered what he had done, he became angry and confronted him. Young George bravely said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet." Washington's father embraced him and rejoiced that his son's honesty was worth more than 1,000 trees. Nope.
Believe it or not, this popular story about the value of honesty and telling the truth was made up by a minister and bookseller named Mason Weems. That guy's crazy.
George Washington was so strong that he once skipped a silver dollar all the way across the Potomac River.
No, the Potomac River is over a mile wide at Mount Vernon, and even George Washington did not have the arm to fling a silver dollar that far. Plus, there were no silver dollars when George Washington was a young man. The first silver dollar coin was made in 1794, when George Washington was 62. Man, I'm just getting sick of that guy.
President Washington was the first to live in the White House.
When George Washington was named the first president in 1789, the White House had not been built yet. In fact, Washington, D.C. was not even the nation's capital. The first president to live in the White House was John Adams. While he was the president, George Washington lived in 2 different houses in New York and then in Pennsylvania. Although he never lived in Washington, D.C. or the White House, George Washington did help build the Capitol. He picked the location of the Federal District, the White House, and the Capitol building.
Stop making fun of me. George Washington wore a white wig as it was the popular style of his time.
Even though wigs were fashionable, George Washington kept his own hair. He kept his hair long and tied back in a ponytail. George Washington did powder his hair, giving it a white color seen in famous portraits. George Washington was actually a redhead.
I guess I'm just a big dummy. I don't even say anything right.
In 1789, in New York, George Washington was granted the full powers and responsibilities of the presidency by the U.S. Constitution. On February 22, 1732, George Washington was born to a wealthy family of tobacco farmers in the colony of Virginia. Washington was introduced to land surveying through a school project where he learned the basics of the profession. When he was 16, his neighbor invited him to join a survey party to lay out large tracts of land along the border of Virginia. In 1749, at the age of 17, he became a professional surveyor. Over the next 3 years, he completed nearly 200 surveys, totaling more than 60,000 acres. He continued to survey at different points in his life, all the way up to the year he died. In 1751, George went to the islands of Barbados with his older brother Lawrence. It was hoped that the tropical weather would help cure Lawrence of his tuberculosis. Lawrence found the terrible heat too much to bear, and he did not improve. George caught smallpox on the island. Fortunately for young George Washington, not only did he recover from the disease, but he now had a lifelong immunity to this killer virus. This means he would never get smallpox again. This would help him in the American Revolution when the country was threatened by a smallpox epidemic. In 1752, when he was 20 years old, he joined the British Provincial Militia and went to be an important military leader during the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. During his military service, he demonstrated his strength, courage, and strategy. He was a natural leader, and his soldiers would follow him without question. When George Washington was 26, he was already a military hero and a large landowner. He was elected to be the Virginia Provincial Legislator. In 1759, a few weeks before he turned 27, he married a wealthy widow named Martha. Martha was 27, and she ran the 5 plantations that were left to her when her first husband died. The Washingtons had no children together, but they raised 2 of Martha's children. The Washingtons lived at Mount Vernon, a large tobacco plantation near Alexandria, Virginia. By 1764, the price of tobacco was very low, and Washingtons were running out of money. George Washington started to grow wheat. He began milling the wheat into flour, breeding horses and pigs, and making whiskey. In 1774, George Washington was selected to be part of the First Continental Congress. The next year, the colonies went to war with the British. Washington showed up at the Second Continental Congress in a full military uniform to let them know he was prepared for war. He was a well-known hero and patriot, so he was asked to lead the Continental Army. He said that he was not qualified for the job, but he was more qualified than anyone else. So John Adams appointed George Washington as the General and Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Even though Washington lost more battles than he won, he had a winning strategy that helped him win most 2 of the important battles in the war: the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Yorktown. After the victory at the Battle of Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. This officially ended the war with Great Britain. 4 years later, in the summer of 1787, George Washington attended the Continental Convention in Philadelphia. He was 100% elected to be the president of the convention. The U.S. Constitution became effective on March 4, 1789. This officially established the United States government. Now, we needed a president. So the Electoral College picked George Washington to be the first president of the United States. He got 100% of the votes. George Washington's first challenge was he had to create the presidency. The United States was an experimental government led by an executive officer, in the words of kings and queens. Washington had to figure out how to act like a president. How did the president dress? He didn't want his clothes to look too expensive, but he needed to dress a little better than the average citizen. What about his horse carriage? How nice would it be? How many horses were too many? These were some things he worried about while he was president. Whenever he was in public, he was on display, and everything he said and did were a symbol of the new republic. George Washington also had to figure out how the presidency should work, even small stuff, like when he entered the Senate. Should the senators rise and stand in respect, or should they sit and treat him like anyone else? One of the first things Washington did was establish a cabinet. This was a group of private, trusted advisors. His cabinet was made up of 4 men. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of Treasury. Henry Knox was Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph was Attorney General. He also had John Adams, the Vice President. In 1896, at the end of his second term as president, George Washington wrote his farewell address to his friends and fellow citizens. This letter was published in newspapers and pamphlets across the country. To this day, Washington's farewell address is considered to be one of the most important documents in American history. On December 12, 1799, Washington was home at Mount Vernon. He was out inspecting his plantation on horseback in snow and freezing rain. That evening, he ate supper without changing out of his wet clothes. He woke up the next morning with a sore throat, but went out in the freezing cold again to mark some trees that he wanted to cut down. Later that night, he woke up having a hard time trying to talk, swallow, or even breathe. Doctors at that time thought that you could treat certain sicknesses by removing blood from someone, so they ended up taking a few pints of Washington's blood. Between losing so much blood and his terrible sickness, George Washington died around 10 o'clock that night on December 14th, 1799, at the age of 67. I hope you've enjoyed some of these facts about George Washington. If you would like to know more, we found a lot of helpful information on mountvernon.org. Click over here if you want to see other videos in this playlist in this series. Click over here to subscribe. Make sure you click this button. I don't care.